Community Remembers Coalition Chatham. The grant program of the Community Remembers Coalition Chatham and the two Chatham NAACP branches, 5377 and 5378, are glad you chose to join us. This evening program is in observance of the 60-year anniversary of the writing of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. letter from Birmingham jail, directed to those ministers who was not supporting his campaign to fill the Birmingham jail because of racial injustice. During his imprisonment, Dr. King's motto was, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." We believe you will find this evening presentation insightful. The ministers that you will hear from today, as soon as they got a phone call, they said, yes, we want to be a part. They are from all parts of life, or walks of life. So please sit back, get comfortable. Don't forget to mute your device. By turning off your audio and video camera, it will reserve bandwidth. Thanks again for being here. At this time, we will hear from Reverend Shante Smith from Mount Sinai AME Church in Pittsburgh.
Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry, it didn't come up on the wrong side. My apologies. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Sister Nettles for pulling this together. It is my great pleasure and honor to be a part of providing responses to such an important letter that is a part of our history. As I kept pondering what exactly to say regarding these first 4 paragraphs of the letter, what was most important to me is that I kind of highlight the form of the letter. The fact that Dr. King wrote this letter to people and using the epistolary form, it allows King to have the capacity to create intimate space as King writes as the author with his readers, who were the ministers at the time and us to today, because King knew that when he was writing this letter that it would be something that would live on in history. By him using this letter writing style, just like the Apostle Paul, he's able to talk to his intended audience at the time and this time. And it allows him to create an intimacy and make this letter really personal. This style of writing that King used, it makes everything so that we're able to understand better his firsthand experiences along with his inner thoughts. And so I highlighted what for me was the most important phrases that he said in these first 4 paragraphs, which is that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, so that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And for me, this was the most important part of this letter because it just lets us know that we are all a community. We can't operate with the spirit of individualism, because as a community, when something is happening to somebody who we've turned an other, it could inadvertently end up happening to us. Therefore, we should operate as a community, and justice for all is the only way that we actually have justice in our land. So that concludes my remarks on these first 4 paragraphs.
Thank you, Reverend Smith. Let me let some folks in. Okay. At this time, we will hear from Reverend Evan Harrison from Pittsburgh Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh.
Thanks. And in paragraph 5, Reverend Martin Luther King talks about how the clergy deplored the demonstrations, but he was sad that they didn't deplore the conditions that underlied them. And I think this points to how in our everyday life, it's very tempting to react to things. And it takes a lot more of a spiritual discipline. And it's a harder and more difficult and more powerful thing to respond instead of just react. And this whole letter is just a beautiful and powerful response and the direct action that King was involved in and led so many in. The next paragraph, 6, talks about the roadmap he uses, which I think still is so powerful for us today. And as I look at the different equity groups in Chatham, I feel like we're all using a lot of these. First, you look for injustice and collect facts. And that has led to so many things. And that is still a huge forefront of how we can work on the systemic racism today that invites disparate outcomes without necessarily any personal animosity between people. So we still got to look for the statistics and look for the disparate outcomes. The second step is to negotiate. If that fails, there's a need to self-purify before the final step, which is direct action. And we see that in, again, a lot of the things that have been done, remembering the lynchings and the plaque for the memorial service, the renaming of the middle school, addressing overt racism in our Chatham schools in 2022, addressing discrepancies in birthing and mother health, giving babies in Chatham County, also in the school to prison pipeline. All these are concerns that were based on facts and then moved to negotiations. Many of those negotiations went well and groups were given the rights to act on them in good ways, but in other times they needed slightly more pressure. And before that pressure could be applied, we had to really self-purify, which is what he talks about in paragraph 7. I would say take a deep breath. Always helps a response. And if any of y'all have a chance to look up Mamie Chambers, she was a young woman involved in the Birmingham direct actions and had a fire hose turned on her, lost her hearing in one ear, and has lived with that her whole life. And she doesn't regret it. She says, I was ready to pay the price. I would have been ready to pay an even greater price if I needed to. And that's what we have to be willing to do in that purification process before we act and do what it takes in nonviolent and loving ways to get something done. The last paragraph, paragraph 8, talks about timing and about not messing up the timing of a political campaign. And I just think shows all of us that, look, we might care about elected leaders and they can help things go more easily sometimes, but they can do nothing. The best ones, the worst ones, the middle of the road ones can do nothing without citizen support. So tremendous power is in the citizenship to stand up and make their voices heard in nonviolent ways to really get people to think and act. That ends my part.
Thank you, Reverend Harrison. We will now hear from Reverend Dr. Myron Jameson from Rock City Church in Pittsburgh.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. I have verses 9, not verses, I'm thinking I'm preaching. I have paragraph 9 to 11. And a couple of things stood out to me in those paragraphs. One of them was when he said, we have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. And then when you go down a little bit farther in it, it said, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown, is closed to colored children. And then another one down toward the bottom, it says, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in uncomfortable corners, of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes the nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John. And then it goes on to talk about your wife, but then he goes down a little bit further and he said, I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. And I thought this was so powerful when I was reading this, because he was saying to me, what I got out of it was this imperative that we move on this situation now. And we can take the negative out of it, but one of the things that I took out of it also is when I look at today, if there was a fun town today, because of the speeches and the marches and the demonstrations and all the different things that they did, now, no matter what ethnicity you are, you're able to go to a hotel and not have to be in a colored section of a hotel. You're able to drink out of the water fountains, no matter what ethnicity you are. You know, if there was a fun town, now my kids can go to the fun town and have fun at fun town versus me having to explain to my children the reason why they can't go to fun town. So everything that I took out of there was what he wrote in his letter then, but then I took it because of his letter and the things that they did back then. Because of what they did back then, my kids and myself are able to enjoy those things. Had they not done those back then I don't know where we would be now. And that's what I took out of his letter from the Birmingham jail. Move, and let's move now. No, let's not wait. Let's move expeditiously.
Okay. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Jameson. Now we will hear from, at this time, Reverend Dr. Kathy Jones will come to us from Parkwood Institutional CME Church in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Please forgive me. How you doing? Hey, hello, everybody. I am in the car, so please bear with me. And I pray that you can hear me well. I'm talking from paragraphs 13, 14, 15, and 16. And it is concerning just and unjust laws. Kind of a deep subject, very deep and somewhat complicated, but a just law. It's been defined by many, but there are some core features that are generally agreed upon. Just law is a law that is in accordance with justice. It is a law that is fair and equitable, that treats everybody equally, and that is designed to protect the rights and interests of all individuals. Unjust laws, as I see it, and God knows I could be wrong in somebody else's sight, an unjust law is a law that is not in accordance with justice. It is law that is unfair and inequitable, that treats some people unfairly and oppressively, and that does not protect the rights and interests of all individuals. Dr. King talked about the laws so much because he saw so much of the injustice and the inequality going on in that day because of the segregation. And the key difference between just and unjust law is that just law is in accordance with justice, while an unjust law is not. And when we see that, even today, we see just laws and unjust laws. And just laws are sometimes dealing with or shown to people that are not really in line for it. Unjust laws are sometimes demonstrated to people that shows they're being treated fairly. Some examples of unjust laws include the laws that protect the right to life, liberty, and property. The laws that prohibit discrimination, ensure equal treatment under the law. These are examples of just laws. and the laws that guarantee due process and equal protection of the law. Now, let me give you some examples of unjust laws, and they include laws that allow for discrimination, the laws that allow for the persecution of minority groups, and the laws that allow for the abuse of power by the government or other powerful institutions. An unjust law is a law that is not fair or moral. It can be described as a law that is unfair to a certain group of people or that goes against people's basic rights. And we must understand that every human being has basic rights. It's important to speak out against unjust laws and to work to change every one of them. And it is important, this is an important way to promote justice and fairness in our societies. Dr. King was so adamant about making a difference so that the generations that followed him would be able to see a difference. And as I close, in Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, he distinguishes between just and unjust laws. And he said in the letter, just laws is one that upholds human equality and justice. And in the same token, unjust laws does the opposite. King even argues that an unjust law is not a law at all because it does not reflect the will of the people. And finally, King defines a just law as a law that squares with the moral law or the law of God. He defines the moral law as the eternal law of God, which is implanted in the human heart. According to King, God bless his soul, a just law must be based on the golden rule of treating others as you want to be treated. Thank you so much for this opportunity. God bless you.
This is
Thank
the
you, Reverend
Mary?
Dr. Jones.
Excuse
Yes,
me,
ma'am.
Mary. If Shantae's listening, we're getting some requests that your slides be advanced.
Right, I see that. I was getting ready to ask her if she would advance them. I don't have the slides.
Nor do I.
Okay, Reverend Smith has the slides.
I apologize. I did not know that they were going to be advanced.
Okay, we're up to Reverend Lucas Nelson, starting with paragraph 17.
My apologies. I thought the slides were advancing. They appeared, they were advancing on my computer, but okay, my apologies.
Okay, thank you. Reverend Nelson.
Yeah, I was going to give her a moment if she was going to put the slides back up, but I do want to thank everybody for getting to be a part of this and everybody that's here and everybody that's gone before me. So I am talking on paragraph 17 through 20, building on what Reverend Dr. Jones was just talking about with just and unjust laws and the ways that Dr. King called us to speak out against those unjust laws that might exist that were harming our sisters and brothers in different ways. And so he reminded everybody at the beginning of paragraph 17 that you are in good company with the civil dissenters of biblical world and national history. He talked about different people in scripture. He talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego against King Nebuchadnezzar and getting thrown into the fiery furnace and all of these things, and just ways that we too can live into our biblical calling of standing for those that are being treated not as well as others and what standing up for other people as well. And Dr. King talked about being that he even used the example that if he had been in Germany or if he had been in the Soviet Union, he believed that he would also continue to stand up for those that were being oppressed, no matter where it was that he might be living at the time. And so it's a call. There was this implicit question that I was reading in what Dr. King was saying of that would I do the same? That it wasn't just the question of that he would do it, and we could see from his life that we could believe that he would stand up for people no matter what, but that the question as the reader and as the pastors hearing these words, that they might too ask the question of would I stand up for these same things like I see in stories of scripture and stories of history. And so he continued on by leading from one paragraph to the next, talking about the white moderate, who his exact quote said that the white moderate was Negroes' great stumbling block in their stride toward freedom, and that lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And so just this call to the white community to not just sit there on the fence, to actually stand for something. And if you're going to say that you're on this side of freedom, then let's actually stand on this side of freedom. Don't just do it half-heartedly, but lean all the way in, because it's better. That line that he says about lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection kind of hits me every time that I read through this letter. Just a reminder of what it means to stand on the side of justice and stand on the side of those, to be on the side of those, to care for those who are being oppressed in those ways. And it also, as I continue to read these words, it just breaks my heart each time that I read through them, that even though this letter is 60 years old, it's still words that hit as if he had written it yesterday. And that these are words, and when we hear these words about tension that he writes in the last paragraph of that we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with. It's just, I felt like, oh, this is just me turning on the news today, or whatever it might be, whatever's going on in the world. And it's just sad that this is still the case. And it's just a reminder that just because there's those that are stepping forward into this nonviolent direct action of protests and movements and stand-ins and whatever other ways they might be doing nonviolent direct action, it's not that they're the ones creating the tension. They're just naming it for what's already there, and bringing to surface this hidden tension that nobody wants to really talk about. And so it just kind of makes you have a different eyes to see those that are speaking and those that are living into this nonviolent direct action. So that's all that I had for paragraph 17 through 20.
Thank you so much, Reverend Nelson, from Pittsburgh United Methodist Church in Pittsburgh. Reverend Gary Leith is coming to us from Hanks Chapel, United Church of Christ in Pittsburgh.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this program. I have been slated with chapters 21 through 24, paragraphs 21 through 24. And I think Dr. King, as he starts off, he kind of makes a little joke about it, but it's really more of a serious joke. If you can condemn a man that has money in his pocket for being robbed, it's just like, how can you condemn a man to oppression because of the color of his skin? Dr. King was, I think, talking about the entirety of the time of oppression for African Americans, and he was talking to these 8 white ministers, appealing to their conscience, hoping that by appealing to their conscience, they would see themselves in what the African Americans or the Negroes were experiencing as in this time of oppression. I mean, as he used other examples like Socrates, his commitment to truth, and he was made to drink hemlock, and condemning Jesus for his God conscience, his unique God conscience, leading him to crucifixion, the evil acts. Dr. King, I think, was saying that these evil acts are precipitated by those who don't want the change, or those who don't want to accept the change. And as he was continued to talk, or as he continued to write, I think he really pointed out the fact that the generation will be held responsible for the things that are not happening, the things that are not taking place. Because as one of the people from Texas, the white guy from Texas that he wrote about, said that it is not time, because it has taken Christianity over 2,000 years to advance to where it is. And Dr. King says, time is neutral in all of this. Time can be used for the good or for the bad. So you can't put this on time. Over 200 years of slavery and oppression, how much time is necessarily needed for change to take place? For a person to be given their God-given right of freedom, how much time does it take? And I think Dr. King was really adamant about appealing to the conscience of these 8 white ministers in order that they might reach others. He knew that just his voice alone and what he was doing, what he was saying, would not reach everyone, but to reach out to these 8 ministers in hopes that they could reach out to congregations and their congregations and so on and so forth. And then as he goes into paragraph 22, what I take from this is that, extreme times give birth to extreme measures. Dr. King is, pointing out the fact that equality is more than just words spoken. In many cases, it is the result of direct action. There has to be some action in these extreme times in order to give birth to the extreme measures that we desire. We desire equality, and we desire it in a nonviolent way. But there are these factions that are rising up that don't care how we get it. They just want it. And Dr. King is saying, I think in paragraph 23, that he's kind of the bridge that stands between all of these factions, these do-nothings, these Black nationalists, and all these other individuals in the Black community that are taking advantage of the Black community. Dr. King is saying that, I am a bridge. Me and my nonviolent methods are a bridge by which we can reach equality. It doesn't have to be bloodshed, but it's going to come to that if we continue to be turned down for the things that we request, if we continue to be put on the back burner in American society with our desire for freedom. And as we move into the last paragraph, paragraph 24, I think Dr. King is talking about that we can, as a nation, move from extreme oppression to extreme freedom. It's just going to take the will of the people. It's going to take the consciousness of the people to change. It's going to require that we listen to those who are on the side of righteousness and have a change of heart. It all comes down to a change of heart. The mind will not let go sometimes of what the heart is trying to get the life to do. So Dr. King, I think, was speaking to the heart of the individuals in hopes that they would see it from the other side of the fence. If you're on one side of the fence all your life and just looking over, then you get a different picture when you're on the opposite side looking back. And I think that's what he wanted these white ministers to see. He wanted them to be on his side of the fence and looking over so that they could see what he and the Black community were experiencing. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Leith. We will now hear from Reverend Dr. Mark Roster at Hall River Baptist Church in Bynum.
Good afternoon, everyone. Certainly, I appreciate and thank you for allowing me, Ms. Nettles and others, to be a part of this wonderful program. In these paragraphs 21, 25 through 28, Dr. King was identifying that only a few, if any, whites allowed themselves to be associated with the plight of African Americans for any sustained period of time. I believe that this lack of association is because there was not any kind of vested interest in its outcome. Let's be honest. There is an expressional question that goes something like this. What is the difference between a recession and a depression? The answer is a recession is when my neighbor is out of work. A depression is when I'm out of work. So in reality, the truth that African Americans did not have equitable rights did not affect the rights and privileges of whites. They were still employed. They were still bosses and supervisors. They were still government officials. They were still making the laws. They controlled the bulk of the American economy. They only were the only motivating factor that caused those who joined the movement was their conscience. Yet when being associated with the movement, especially with them not being direct benefactors of the outcome, when things got hot, when things began to heat up, or their families began to be called Negro lovers or ostracized by other beings, they disassociated themselves for self-preservation and learned to live with the guilt of withdrawal. In addition, Dr. King was disappointed with the white church. Clearly, the scriptures tell us that God is no respecter of persons. The why is because God is a God of justice. He's not a God of emotions. God, being a God of love and justice, sent his son Jesus into a world of systemic corruption by the powers that be. So therefore, in Kairos time, Jesus came forward in his hometown of Nazareth to proclaim his earthly mission. And the Bible tells us in the God's word translation, these words are found in Luke 4:16 through 19. Then Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. As usual, he went into the synagogue for a day of worship. He stood up to read the lesson. The attendant gave him the book of the prophet Isaiah. He opened it and found the place where it read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to tell the good news to the poor. He has sent me to announce forgiveness to the prisoners of sin, the restoring of sight to the blind, to forgive those who have been shattered by sin, and to announce the year of the Lord's favor." In other words, Jesus' mission was to bring justice and to uplift the poor, the prisoners, the blind, and the other disenfranchised members of our society. So there, regardless of the ethnicity of the church's congregation, we, the church, believers of Jesus Christ, is to continue to carry out the mission of Jesus Christ. So instead of carrying forth the mission, white congregations found scriptures, took them out of context, just to keep those who were already disenfranchised to remain disenfranchised using systemic rules and regulations. This is a disappointment to Dr. King, because if anyone were to stay together, if anyone were to be hand in hand together, it would be the believers of Jesus Christ. And to me, this is what is happening today in today's time. A Florida textbook publisher apparently has now altered the story of Rosa Parks printed in its books by removing all references to her race. They did so in an attempt to comply with the Florida Republican legislation regarding race and school curriculum. The bottom line, my brothers and sisters, is that there is now a movement throughout America to silence any references to African Americans' accomplishments and our contributions to American history. It is a movement mostly by white Americans who desire to publish and to read a sanitized history rather than to be reminded of the atrocities of the past toward African Americans. And I truly believe that this is what Dr. King is talking about. Yes, there are a few, a precious few, whose conscience outweigh everything that one could ever think about in order to stay part of the movement. But there are so many others, as Dr. King found out, that are not willing to really give up any of their privileges and to stand hand in hand, arm in arm with African Americans saying, "We shall overcome." So yes, Dr. King, the disappointment is still here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Royster. Reverend Smith, can I get you to forward the slides to 29 and 32? I've tried clicking on it myself and it won't let me do it.
Mary, she is unable to. If you look in the chat, I put a notice in there that her computer decided to update Zoom during the program. She's trying to actually take them down. So she's
Okay,
we did have an audience member ask that the slides be available at a later date.
okay. Thank you so much. At this time, we will hear from Bishop Olivia Livingston. She is coming to us from Pittsburgh Church of God in Pittsburgh. You're muted.
Thank you, there we go. Thank you so much for this opportunity to participate in this awesome program. I have paragraphs 29 through 32. Dr. King asked the question, aren't justice and love supposed to be our theme?
Right.
In paragraph 29, Dr. King, he is so disappointed in the Southern religious leaders in the South. He thought the white churches in the South would support the movement as soon as the bus boycott started in Montgomery. But no, oh no, that didn't happen. I heard Reverend Gary Leaf talk about the do-nothings. So they became the do-nothings. Dr. King bemoans the nonsense. So many white clergymen stand that they stood on the sideline. They were spewing out their sanctimonious frivolities. We know all about sanctimonious frivolities. We've seen that on TV. We watched it on CNN when these evangelicals would say there's nothing wrong with what's going on in the society right now. See, they were wondering, Dr. King was wondering if they actually understood the Bible, making unbiblical distinctions between the sacred and the secular. Even today, sometimes we cannot separate ourselves from the secular and the sacred in the church. We don't know the difference. We can't even feel the difference. We don't see the difference sometimes, even when we are in church. In paragraph number 30, Dr. King is wondering about the members in these Southern churches. He wonders, what are they worshiping? Are they worshiping God, or are they worshiping somebody else? Because he's not seeing the help that they should have in providing the Black people with equal opportunity. What type of members, he asks, are silencing their voices when weary men and women stood tall in protest? Do these white churches want to help the Black community seek justice? But oh no, very few of them were trying to do that. In paragraph 31, we see that Dr. King admits to crying or lamenting over the laxity of the church, because the church is not exercising the rights that God has already given us to stand for justice. Even though Dr. King loves the church and the deep love and the deep wisdom that it stands for, he sees the church as the body of Christ, but now that body is something's wrong. The body is being blemished. The body is going through a social neglect. When you read Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 14, we know that Jesus came down to bring us together, the Jews and the Gentiles, because he said we're neither Jew nor Gentile, we're neither bond nor free. So he was bringing all the differences, all the hostility together into one, into creating a oneness. But see, with the lack of energy to fight for the cause, these Black churches and these white churches in the South, they're just not measuring up, and he is in lament. And when I look at paragraph 32, Dr. King worries if the church keeps operating in a contemporary weak state. Well, what's contemporary? Which means that they're being lackadaisical. They're not doing all that they can do. You heard the song, Lord, I'm going to do all I can do. We sing that, we preach that, but are we really doing that? The church, he is saying, will eventually fade into irrelevance, only becoming an arch defender of the status quo. And in 2023, we see many churches across the United States who are now arch defenders of the status quo. In conclusion, Dr. King praises the few religious people who have taken a stand to join the movement, saying that these are the true heroes of the church. In closing, I ask you, are you truly a hero of the church and of justice? Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Bishop Livingston. We will now hear from Reverend Brent Levy from the local church in Pittsburgh.
Good evening, friends. So good to be with you all and to share in this night with you and my siblings in ministry. I feel in such good company, and I'm grateful for the privilege of sitting at your feet and gleaning your wisdom. Thanks be to God. My section of the letter begins with these strong words from Dr. King, quote, but the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. He goes on to say, every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. We've heard it again and again and again tonight that, dare I say, this is still true. It reminds me of another quotation attributed to the Reverend Dr. King that I heard first when I was in divinity school. Something to the effect of, the church is too often the taillights rather than the headlights. The church is too often the taillights rather than the headlights. In other words, rather than leading the way, claiming our moral authority and giving voice and action and witness to a life rooted in God's dream where all belong, where all have enough, where every person knows, and not just knows, but feels their sacred worth, where violence gives way to peace and justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Instead of that, we often find ourselves bringing up the rear, late to the party, with everyone else looking around at each other, wondering, what took you so long? And I've found this to be true, not in every case to be sure, but broadly speaking, yes, and especially among the white moderates that we've heard so much about tonight. Whether it's systemic racism or police brutality, gender and sexual identity, marriage equality, climate change, the list goes on. We've too often surrendered our moral authority to nonprofits and activist groups and the like. We'll dance around it, try to say something without really saying anything. Lord knows I'm guilty of this too. In the words of Dr. King from the section that I had, paragraphs 33 through 36, he says, organized religion has become too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world. It's a heck of a condemnation, and we wonder why there's so much hand-wringing about the church in America in decline even now. In one of his daily meditations last year, Father Richard Rohr wrote this. He said, quote, some new studies indicate that Christians are not as much leaving Christianity as they are realigning with groups that live Christian values in the world, instead of just gathering again to hear the readings and recite the creed and sing songs on Sunday. Jesus does not need our singing. We need to instead act like a community, what Dr. King would call beloved community. And he saw it coming. And what remains true is that indeed the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. How he opens paragraph 33, the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. The word judgment now can be scary, right? It's one of those church words that carries a lot of baggage when we hear the judgment of God. In Greek, actually, the word is krusis, which is where we get the word crisis from. It's also where the word cross comes from. I talked about this at the local church a couple of weeks back. As in the moment you find yourself at a crossroads, right? And so judgment is not necessarily an external condemnation as much as it is self-condemnation, internal condemnation, that conviction that we might feel deep in our bones, the lump in our throat, the pit in our stomach, that all is not as it should be. In other words, when we hear that the judgment of God is upon the church as never before, it means that we find ourselves at a crossroads, at a point of crisis. How will we respond to Reverend Harrison's point earlier, as the taillights or as the headlights? This past summer, I'll just wrap with this. I heard a story that I hadn't before about how Dr. King's journey as a civil rights leader began. I was surprised to learn that it started pretty reluctantly for him. Maybe you've heard it. It bears repeating if so. But Dr. King happened to be a new minister in Montgomery in the wake of the Montgomery bus boycott. And because he was relatively new and was generally well respected, mostly because he was too new to have upset anyone, he was elected leader of the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association in 1955. And this election apparently caught him off guard. He responded in this way to his election: "Well, if you think I can render some service, I will." The boycott and the protests dragged on into the new year, 1956, and he'd been imprisoned for a brief period of time. And on the night that he was released from jail, he retreated back home and felt that he needed some space away from the crowds, from the demands, from the imprisonment, from the work, to simply process all that was happening, all that he'd experienced, and what his next steps might be. And so once his wife and his daughter were in bed that night, he sat by himself at his kitchen table with only a cup of coffee and the Holy Spirit to keep him company. And this was a moment of crisis for him, right? That crossroads, the judgment of God upon him. And he responded. Describing the moment, Dr. King would later say, quote, "It seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, 'Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth.'" And so he did. In that moment of crisis, that moment of judgment, he didn't react, he responded. And that same judgment, that same moment of crisis is indeed upon us too still. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Levy. We will now hear from Reverend Barry Gray from First Missionary Baptist Church in Littleton, North Carolina.
All right, I'd like to say good evening to everyone. I had the final section of the letter, which was very intriguing. The 37th paragraph of Dr. King's letter summarized and brought to a close his frustration, as well as sense of betrayal from some of the people that Dr. King thought should have been with him in his fight for justice and peace. Dr. King apologized for writing such a lengthy letter, but he assured his readers that had he been at home at his own desk, he said that the letter would have been much shorter. Dr. King said there's nothing else in here to do but think long thoughts and pray long prayers. Dr. King went on and apologized again for the fact that he may have crossed the line in overstating the truth, or perhaps he might have understood the facts, overstated the facts in the purpose of his writing. But King hoped that his exercise of patience, meaning not moving too fast or too slow, had not upset some of the brotherhood. And then lastly, Dr. King closed by encouraging all of his readers and listeners to be strong in their faith and to anticipate a personal visit from him when the circumstances allow. Dr. King said, when I come, I'm coming not as a civilian civil rights leader or a person who fights for integration, but I simply want to come to you as a pastor and a Christian brother. Dr. King believed that his dream and his aspirations would one day come to fruition. His hope and prayer was that the dark clouds of racial prejudice, along with the fear of the people of his community, would, in not too distant future, be turned into the radiant stars of love and brotherhood that would shine over our great nation for all of the people. Dr. King really believed that one day people, Black, white, every race, creed, and color would come together and live under one nation, under God. And we are still believing and anticipating, even with the struggles we have today, that these words will come true. So again, thank you, and may God bless you.
Thank you, Reverend Gray. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Dr. King said, "We may have come on different ships, but we're in the same boat now." He said, "If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. Remember, progress does not just happen. You must work for it." We hope you have been inspired by this evening's very powerful presentation and learned a great deal from our community leaders about why it is important to remember our past and stay focused on the future. Please join us on Saturday, May 13th, for the presentation of the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation mural and Student Racial Justice Essay Contest. The program will be held at the George Moses Horton Middle School from 9 to 11 a.m. You will receive an invitation to join us in person for this meaningful event. We invite you to become a member of the CRC-C by going to our website, crc-c.org, and scroll down to the homepage to the Join Us section. We are looking forward to welcoming you to our group. Before closing, I would like to give special thanks to our speakers, Reverend Shante Smith, Reverend Evan Harrison, Reverend Dr. Myron Jameson, Reverend Dr. Kathy Jones, Reverend Lucas Nelson, Reverend Gary Leith, Reverend Dr. Mark Royster, Reverend Olivia Livingston, Reverend Brent Levy, and Reverend Barry Gray. Thanks to our host, Ms. Rita Van Doom, Branch Director of the Chatham Community Library, for the IT support, our co-host, Reverend Shante Smith, and finally, thanks again to each one of you for being here this evening. Have a wonderful and safe week. Thank you.